30 minutes later, an outraged Cecilia was crouching behind a rocky basalt outcrop just on the outskirts of the forest, listening in fascinated horror as Snape participated in what she assumed was a Death Eater meeting. She had followed Snape as far as she dared, which was far further than she would ever have done if she had not had a drink, and she had overheard a circle of wizards in masks talking. Inchwise, Cecilia crept forward until she could detect what was being said. Not much of it meant anything to her, but she listened anyway, in order to gain enough evidence to take to Dumbledore. She could barely believe it. Less than an hour ago, she was sitting in a pub having a discussion with him about science and magic, and now Snape was telling them all about what lessons the students had been taught, when various professors would be absent from Hogwarts, even Harry's whereabouts at certain times in the week. She wanted to call out and stop Snape from talking, try to stem the flow of treachery from his lips. After all she had done, more than some would have, she had put her heart and soul into their research, only for Snape to hand it all on a plate to the enemy. If only she could hear all of their conversation, then at least she might be able to understand some of it. As you very well know, Lucius, the Dark Lord is unable to be present. Nor I fear too many of his followers. Yet the dark mark burns, Crabbe. You know that not one of us can withstand its beckoning. I am here. Avery, how kind to drop by. Should we take from your absence that you have been intending to lie to us. Don apostrophe T. Say another word. I can see into your deceitful mind. That expression, thought Cecilia. The way that one of them had spoken. Why did it sound familiar? Lucius, please. Your father only did so much to hide the trail. We really thought you could do better. But the manuscripts. When the Blood Traitor died. Yes. The last voice. To Cecilia it sounded like a woman. We couldn't find them. We've been over and over this, Avery. Next time, you will be answering to the Dark Lord. Consider this a dress rehearsal. The one called Avery fell to his knees. The Death Eater called Lucius began to torture him. She heard Snape utter something under his breath, wand in hand. Within seconds, Avery was on the floor, writing in agony and screaming. Do not fail this time, Avery. How long do we have? We are far from a connection. No. Screamed a voice in Cecilia's head. Severus, what are you saying? Don't tell them that. It must be sooner. Is all prepared? Halloween. We attack then. More casualties for their please forced to investigate, I fear. With the last statement, the Death Eater laughed, and was joined by the rest. What was that, thought Cecilia, something about an attack. She swallowed, and sank back behind the rock. He'd said something about the police. She thought back to a conversation she'd had. On her first day at Grimmauld Place. They'd said wizard police were called as. That means they were planning to go after moles on Halloween. The bright lights of the image she had seen of Tunks's work. The twisted face of the man before he died. They were planning mole baiting. She didn't know how, but she had to stop them. Before she had time to think, she realized that the group of Death Eaters were moving towards her. She could hear a thump across the ground, getting nearer and nearer. Dizzy with rising fear, she wondered whether she could risk a look. Maybe they were heading in a different direction. Slowly she got to her knees and turned. To see a huge dog standing before her, baring its teeth, saliva dripping from its mouth. Forgetting the predicament that was approaching behind 3 feet of basalt, she stared at the dog. Its eyes looked glazed as if mad, its fur filthy and matted. Before she could decide what to do, it growled again, opening its jaws. Cecilia crouched further down, looking at the ground, waiting for it to strike. Then she felt a sharp tugging on her left arm. Cecilia opened her eyes. Sirius Black was pulling her by the wrist. "Come on, quickly you fool, or there won't be time," he urged gruffly, pulling her up from her half-crouched position. She had no choice but to do so and run in the direction he was pulling her, much quicker than she was prepared for, and she stumbled forward. Sirius pulled her up roughly, and her knees scraped the hard ground. He barely gave her time to balance before turning in the direction of the castle, leaving the voices of the Death Eaters behind her, the ground still uneven. It took everything Cecilia had to remain upright. They ran up a hill, and were now quite far enough away from the Death Eaters that the rising panic in her chest had subsided. Sirius pulled her down, crouching on the hard earth. "Don't you realize how dangerous it is out here?" he said reprovingly, looking past the trees in the direction they had come. "All manner of things are lurking out here." Cecilia said nothing. Her head was fuzzy, a combination of the effects of the butterbeer and the flight they had just made. She tried to think. There was a dog ... then black ... Why is he here? She looked between her wrist and his hand, as Sirius watched out over the hillock. If I can just gauge when he is distracted, thought Cecilia, then I can get away. Waiting a few seconds, she built up the courage to pull ... He was looking further afield now, as if the Death Eaters had changed direction. Slowly, she was about to slip her wrist out of his grip, but she wasn't fast enough. Sirius spun round and grabbed it, looking at her with intent. "Oh no you don't," he said, giving Cecilia a firm stare and ignoring her pleas to let go. "Haven't you registered yet in your tiny mind anything I've been saying? Do you really think you can get past 8 Death Eaters on your own?" He gestured in the direction he had just been looking. "I don't care, she gasped, "just let me go." Ignoring her, Sirius gripped her wrist tighter. She winced. "Come on," he said, "we have to hide. There's no going back to the castle now." They rounded a hill at the back of the castle grounds, hurrying further and faster away from it. Cecilia noticed as they passed a path trailing in the direction of Hagrid's hut, and she wished she had done what Severus had said earlier, returned to the castle, or at least gone and spoken to Hagrid. Just as Cecilia thought she wouldn't be able to keep up with Sirius's pace any longer, he slowed as they neared a solitary tree, whose branches of the tree were swaying, as if caught by the wind. This struck Cecilia as odd because the night air was quite still. Sirius stopped, and pulled his wand from his robe, pointing at the tree. "Immobilis," he said, and suddenly a dull ache of apprehension began to form in Cecilia's chest. "Oh heavens," thought Cecilia, looking at it, then following her eyeline down to his arm. The last time she remembered seeing Sirius he was holding his wand. "Come on," he said urgently. "Down there." He gestured towards a small entrance between the roots of the tree. Cecilia froze. Sirius began to raise his wand again. On cue, the mournful wail of a wolf penetrated the air and he gave her a told-you-so look. "Like I said, it's dangerous out here," he said menacingly, flicking his wand towards the hole. "Come on, quickly." Cecilia looked at it and took a step. "The only thing round here that is dangerous, Black, is you," she thought, walking towards the base of the tree, hopes diminishing of a last-minute getaway. Sirius followed close behind her, edging her roughly inside when she hesitated. He stepped forward and led her down a small passage where thickened muscular roots protruding from the walls. Once or twice Cecilia stumbled in the dark, Sirius pulling her up by the wrist which he still had gripped firmly in his hand. Ahead of them was the light of an old house, and they entered a decrepit room, ancient furniture thick with dust and hung with cobwebs. Cecilia shivered as logic pervaded her mind. If he was trying to keep her safe, she couldn't see how. They could easily have slipped back to the castle, or to Hagrid's hut. What was the reason for them coming to this old deserted house? Unless... Urgent panic began to rise now, and Cecilia tried again to desperately yank her hand back from Sirius, heading towards the door and out the way they had just come in. Mrs. Frobisher, that was extremely foolish, intoned Sirius, managing to get a grip on her hand as she attempted to leave. With his other hand he gripped his wand. "Careful, or I may have to use this." "You coward," thought Cecilia, looking between the wand and his face as Sirius wrestled a firmer grip on gripping her by wrist again, and pulled her back through, throwing her onto the dusty floor. She fell heavily, grazing her legs. Get up," said Sirius, wand still aloft, looking back out through the door of the room. The silence that reigned was interrupted by a mouse running over the floor. Raising his wand, a bolt of yellow light hit the mouse, and it died, just like the one that Draco Malfoy had killed. Cecilia looked open-mouthed at Sirius's realization flooded her mind. She knew she'd recognized it. The light of the spell was the same light she remembered flashing through the Grimmauld Place kitchen. "Rodents," he said simply. Then he saw the look of terror on Cecilia's face, and glanced between the tip of his wand then back at her. He lowered it. Cecilia tried to make for the exit a second time, but this time Sirius was too quick, and grabbed her round the waist, wrestling her to the floor. She screamed, but he pushed her down, trying to cover her mouth with his hand. Cecilia bit it hard. "Ah!" yelled Sirius, letting her go. "You silly woman, what did you go and follow him for? How long do you think it would have been till they'd have found you?" "A minute." He looked down at her crossly, rubbing his hand. "I save your life and this is the thanks I get?" He began to pace across the entrance to the room, glancing across at her sporadically. "But Severus," she said, thinking about why she'd followed him. "He keeps rushing off. I thought he was doing work for the Order. But he's a Death Eater. We've got to tell Dumbledore before they act on his information." Sirius looked at her, and continued pacing. "Of course he's a Death Eater," said Sirius, still pacing. "And that's what I've been telling Dumbledore for ages. It's only a matter of time before he betrays us all." Cecilia said nothing. "Dumbledore knew?" "Dumbledore knows," she said, eventually. "He trusts him?" Sirius laughed, mockingly. "That's Snivellus' saving grace, isn't it? A reformed Death Eater. A teacher at Hogwarts. Respectability. A double agent is what he is. On Dumbledore's side, supposedly." Cecilia looked at the floor. So that was it, was it? A double agent. Feeding lies to the enemy to contain them, mislead them. Unable to help that man Avery because so much was at stake. Her mind tried to allocate this new piece of information into her picture of Snape. He was helping Dumbledore, not betraying them. She thought about everything that had gone on, his behavior and how he'd acted. Now the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Slowly, the tightness in her chest began to recede, and the memories of the evening, of their closeness that had made her feel like the traitor for doubting him. She glanced at Sirius. "I've still got to get out of here. I need to warn Dumbledore. I heard what they said. There's going to be an attack at Halloween on Muggles." As she spoke, she got up, and moved towards the door. Sirius looked at her and moved in front of her, looking her up and down. "Sit," he ordered, pointing towards the broken piano stool. Cecilia stared back at him, glancing at his wand again. "Sit down, Cecilia," he repeated, but this time his voice had softened. "Why? You can't leave yet, it wouldn't be safe." "But the Death Eaters have gone now. They were waiting for one of their number. Avery. They've gone to London. To meet others. There are other things lurking around out there, my dear." "Like what? Werewolves?" she said, skeptically. He jerked his head back towards her, a look of shock crossed his face momentarily. "Yes," he said simply. "We have to wait until dawn." "Well, If it's a choice of staying here with you, or facing imaginary werewolves, I think I'll take my chances with them, thanks. Cecilia sat down on the dusty piano stool, and folded her arms again. You really don't like me, do you? Cecilia laughed, scornfully. Why do you say that, Black? Said Cecilia, throwing him a look of contempt. What reason would I have? Now let me think. Could it be that the last time we saw each other, you were trying to do me in? Excuse me for inferring from your actions tonight that you weren't trying to finish the job. She folded her arms tighter and glanced to one side. Sirius walked towards her. I can tell you've been around Snivellus, he retorted, the sarcasms catching. No, that's me, I'm afraid, a stupid mull and whatever else you'd like to call me. It's got nothing to do with Severus. She looked back at Sirius. Shame on you for being so rude, the teacher in her added. Besides, until you explain to me firstly why you think I need your protection, I'm not staying here another minute. Cecilia got to her feet, then paused. How come you knew where I was anyway? I thought you weren't able to leave Grimmauld Place? And what was that mangy dog doing there? He said nothing, looking down at the dusty floor. Well, if you can't justify your kidnapping of me, Black, then I am actually leaving, she declared, taking the moral high ground and wondering whether he would call her bluff. How long do you think you could survive out there? He said quietly, walking in front of her. Do you know what will happen if a werewolf catches you? There was a long pause. Enlighten me. They don't kill you straight away, he said, his dark eyes shimmering in the half-light as he paced round her. First, when they've caught you, and I must say, I've never seen anything run as fast as a werewolf after its prey, it will paw you. And by that I don't mean in a soft fluffy animal way. The last time the Ministry found a person pawed by a werewolf, it took them 3 days to identify the body. He stopped, taking in her dumbfounded expression. Werewolves didn't exist, she knew, Severus had told her that. So why did Black's story sound so real? Should that not kill you? He continued, continuing to pace round her. Then the werewolf tearing your throat out, or disemboweling you would quite possibly finish you off. Cecilia opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was so dry, all that came out was a dull cough. She swallowed. So, if that's the case, Black, she said, with all the courage she could muster, how come these so-called werewolves didn't get you? In case you hadn't noticed, I was in the form of a dog. And Mr. Snuffles wasn't best pleased at the mangy part of your description. You were the dog? She said, astonished. I'm an animagus. He paused, allowing the information to settle in. Animagi can transform into other animals. It comes in very handy as a disguise, and offers some measure of protection. I can become a dog. And before her very eyes, Cecilia gasped as Sirius's form receded, and the big black dog which had stood before her earlier that evening stared back at her. How did you do it? Asked Cecilia eventually, shaking her head in disbelief. Sirius reappeared before her. It's quite complicated. You are supposed to register your animagus form with the Ministry when you do it, but I never did. That's why I can move around unnoticed. But what about your clothes? She pressed. When you transformed, you weren't a dog with clothes round you, yet when you changed back, you were clothed. Unless it's part of the spell, she mused. It must be, else it wouldn't make sense. Sirius laughed, grinning at her. The legendary Cecilia Frobisher and her scientific mind. He said, mockingly. Is there any point in my simply saying that it's magic? I am quite convinced you won't accept that as an answer. But there must be some sort of code, a program in you spell that means they are there or not. Cecilia began to pace round the dilapidated room. If it's genetic, there must be something that controls the outer of the clothes. Clothes aren't part of you? You're not born with clothes. Sirius rolled his eyes and shook his head. Only a mole could ever think like that, he said, conceding defeat. She gave him a contemptuous look. But why do your clothes reappear though? She persisted. They are matter, after all, substance. Probably for the same reason yours don't after you've had a bath. He stepped away from Cecilia, with a gleam in his eye, watching the horrified expression form on her face. What did you say? Her mind raced. Had he said what she thought she'd heard him say? Had he spied on her in Grimmauld Place? What else had he done while she'd been there, apart from attempting to kill her? And a mighty fine body too. Lovely legs. He indicated her figure by giving an outline of it with his hands. Black? You spied on me? The shock of his acknowledgement had brought her down to earth so hard, that was all she could manage. Yes, he said, playing on her shock. I have been making sure you were all right. I had no choice, Cecilia, he continued, as she took a couple of steps towards him. I told Dumbledore to tell you I was sorry for what I did. I wanted to tell you myself. But still Remus wouldn't let me near you. You mean ... You've been spying on me in my room here? At Hogwarts? Sirius began to chuckle, then noticed her expression. It's not like I haven't seen it all before, you know. You have a very nice body, from the little I've seen of it, Cecilia. Well-padded bottom. Sirius stepped closer, and she could feel his hot breath on her cheek. Cecilia could feel his eyes, scanning her body as he approached. The slap came out of nowhere. Sirius hadn't been expecting it and he stepped back slightly, in shock. Cecilia folded her arms resolutely, and sat back down on the piano stool. Well, I hope you had a very good look, she said quietly. Then you will also have seen what it was you did to me. She bowed her head. Madame Pomfrey thinks I'm lucky to still be able to walk after what you tried. Silence reigned for a few minutes. Cecilia continued to stare at the floor, and Sirius held his stinging cheek. Eventually, he spoke. I suppose I deserved that, he said, looking at Cecilia. She looked back up at him. When can I get out of here? She said. I told you, we have to wait for the morning ... because of their werewolves, she finished sardonically. Come off it, Sirius. The last thing I thought you were was a liar. It's true, he said. Why died? You don't believe me? Their eyes met briefly and the thoughts Cecilia had, the first time she saw Sirius, filled her mind. Sorrowful ... yet reckless ... handle with care. Cecilia stemmed her thoughts, mentally shaking her head, and looked back down. Cecilia, he said, I am sorry for what I did. It was wrong, I was mistaken ... impetuous. Their eyes locked again. Cecilia smiled a little. He actually did look sorry. Sirius stood up. Well, I'm glad I did check your room tonight. I'm not sure you are fully aware of what Death Eaters might have done to you, should they have found you, he added. Believe me, I have a good idea, she replied. But I didn't know Severus was going to join me in the pub. I was supposed to be meeting Nimetonks for a drink, but she couldn't make it. She looked down at the floor again. Are you sure there's no other way out? She asked hopefully. Sirius shook his head. Here, he said, throwing her his coat. It was brown and a bit muddy and about 50 years old. Try and get some sleep, he added, sinking into the corner of one of the rooms, closing his eyes. Cecilia looked back at the coat. It smelt of dog. That figures, she thought, as she sat with her knees up to her chest on the floor by the piano, pulling it over her. I still don't trust you, Sirius, she thought, surprised by its warmth. But I can feign sleep when my life might be in danger, so there's no harm in acting. Comfortable? Asked Sirius, opening his eyes and looking at her. I wouldn't say that, she replied, then added, but warm. Thanks. So Severus isn't a traitor then? She said, after some time. As much as it pains me to say this, Cecilia, no, he is not. There's nothing I'd love nothing more than to get rid of the greasy git and never have him darken the doors of my home any more than they are already dark. But sadly, his role in the order is too valuable. There was a pause. Did you say he found you in the Three Broomsticks? Yes, said Cecilia. I was waiting for Tunks. I thought she might be late. Remus said 9.30, but I thought I'd hang on a bit. You spoke to Remus? Sirius sat up, and stared at Cecilia. Yes, Friday, she said. Not that it's any of your business, she added. And does my darling cousin know of your secret liaison? He said, teasingly. Cecilia sat up, and stared at Sirius, feeling quite grateful that it was dark and he couldn't see her blush. We only talked, she said quickly. He was kind enough to want to know how I was, if you must know. Sirius's eyes widened, and he chuckled slightly. Mrs. Frobisher, have we touched a nerve? Remus said he was quite shocked that someone he considered his best friend would behave like you did. How many more times do I have to say I am sorry? Said Sirius, defensively. It's going to be a long night if we're going to be arguing about this. More silence. Do all fires connect to the flue? Said Cecilia. It was bizarre when Remus first spoke to me from it, and then the flickering over the last few weeks. Now I know it was you spying on me. I thought I was going mad. Well, probably, said Sirius, yawning, and I suggest you wear a little more when stepping out of the bathroom, in future. He said, not that I minded the view, I must say, he added as Cecilia huffed her disapproval. And just how long have spying on me? She asked indignantly. Long enough to know that you look really sexy in your pink and blue stripy pajamas and fluffy bunny slippers, and when you put on that green stuff on your face, there's a significant improvement. Cecilia pulled a face at him in the dark. Seriously though, I really did just want to check you're okay, he said, evenly. You really don't trust Severus, do you? Yes, I've noticed you're on first-name terms with him. I'm not going to apologize for making sure you are safe, though, and Harry too. You can't help not fully understanding everything that's going on around you. But that doesn't mean I'm incapable, Black, thought Cecilia, and the phrase she had read in Sirius's letter to Harry sprang to the front of her mind. So you truly believe I can't comprehend what's going on simply because I'm a mole? She thought crossly. Just because Dumbledore trusts him, doesn't mean he wouldn't try anything. Sirius continued. I trust him more than I trust you, she fired back, sitting up. After what you saw tonight? Well, after what you just told me, yes, she said, leaning forward in Sirius's direction. And not about Severus, she added silently. I can't believe I'm stuck here with you for a whole night, she said, irritably. It's going to be so much fun. And before you call me a stupid mull again, perhaps you could evaluate your actions as to the letter you sent to Harry? Letter? Sirius got to his feet quickly. What do you know of a letter? He moved over to her. Telling him if anything happens to you your hopes were with him, she continued provocatively. I mean, not putting any pressure on him at all, are you? And who are you to be telling me anything I should be saying to Harry? I'm practically the closest family he has. Sirius stood up, leaning towards her. Well, I'm not sure you know much about families, Black, but they don't go around adding more pressure to a child who is under so much pressure as it is. You don't need to tell me that. He shouted, making her jump. Cecilia got to her feet and they stood face to face. Well, perhaps I do. I possibly have had a smidgen more experience with children than you. She paced over to the four-poster bed and, arms folded, sat down heavily. It collapsed, covering her in dust, cobwebs and old cloth. Sirius burst out laughing. He crossed the room to where Cecilia was fighting the cloth which covered her and coughing heavily because of the dust, and held out a hand. When she finally got her head and arms free, she took it. "That's the funniest thing I've seen all year," he said, chuckling as he helped her grumpily to her feet. "Then you can't have got out much," she retorted, then instantly regretted it. She looked into his beautiful dark eyes. He continued to laugh, and she smiled too, thinking what a sight she must look. "Are you okay?" he said, still chuckling. "Fine," she said, thinking of the 1 or 2 bruises she would be sporting in the morning. She leaned down to feel her leg. There was a small trickle of blood which she quickly wiped it away with her finger before sitting back down on the floor, knees to chest on Sirius's coat. "We used to come here, all of us, to the Shrieking Shack," said Sirius, his laughter waning. "Harry's father James, Remus ... Peter." He frowned. "This is the most haunted house in Britain, you know." Cecilia smiled, resisting the challenge to argue. He sat down next to her. "Us 4, sneaking off at nights for a laugh, hanging out here while the other good students were tucked up safely in their beds." "The marauders," said Cecilia, as the canute dropped. She glanced up at Sirius's confused face. "Tunks told me." "Minerva gave you the name," she added, smiling knowingly. "More often than not we spent our time thinking up new and unusual setups for dear old Sniv." She caught her look. "Snape." "Bully," said Cecilia. She sighed, exhaustion overcoming her. "Can't believe got to stay here, with you." She goaded again, despite her creeping exhaustion. "Peeping Tom," she added mischievously. "Hey," said Sirius in tones of mock injury. "That's what comes of sticking your nose in where it's not needed, you strange, strange woman. However," he continued, turning to face her, "from what I see you do to prepare for lessons that aren't even of consequence is admirable." She frowned at him. "Not of consequence? I mean, you don't need to do them." "That's where you're wrong, Black," she said quickly. "How else will the next generation of wizards and witches realize that moles, as you so politely call us, are not threatening to them? What else can I do to prevent another Voldemort?" She pointed in the direction of the door, "or his followers from appearing again? People I know might die then. People I live and work with. I'm afraid you're quite wrong, Sirius. My lessons are of consequence." "Do you have any children, Cecilia?" asked Sirius quietly. Cecilia could feel the color draining from her face. She turned away, and looked at the wall. "I apologize," he said eventually, when she said nothing. "I suggest you get some rest," he added, retreating to the corner of the room. "Keep my coat, if you wish, it's turned much colder, there'll probably be a frost." Cecilia pulled the coat round her shoulders, without saying a word. "Damn you, Sirius Black," she thought, as she wiped a tear from her cheek. "Damn you. 88,888,888. Cecilia was awoken by something touching her shoulder. Turning to one side, she was about to push Dobby away, then she started. A huge black dog was nuzzling her. She blinked as the weak sunlight penetrated the room around her, and she sat up, and looked at herself, her hair full of dust, clothes torn and filthy. The dog transformed into Sirius Black, and Cecilia sighed as she stood up. The events of the last night then cascaded over her. She glanced at him, suspiciously. "Mr. Snuffles was checking to make sure everything was all right," said Sirius, watching her glimpse at the exit. "So I can go now?" she said. He nodded, and she breathed a sigh of relief. "Only if you want to," he added, with a wink. "Believe me, I want to," said Cecilia, narrowing her eyes. They emerged into the early morning sunlight, and Sirius led her to the entrance of a secret passage that he explained to her would take her to a door in the oak paneling by the portrait of the Fat Lady. They walked over the land between the Shrieking Shack to Hogwarts in silence, each of them glancing at the other as they went, and Cecilia considered the way in which Sirius had treated her. Ignoring his obvious personality discrepancies, arrogance, narcissism, prejudice, conceit, vanity. She actually hadn't felt out of control or vulnerable last night, all in all. Not like she'd expected she'd feel. Perhaps this was a new start, she thought. He might have actually realized he had gone too far. Soon they reached a passage hidden behind some bushes. Cecilia recognized where they were, and remembered passing this side of the castle the previous night on the way to the Three Broomsticks. The passage continued under the basalt rocks that were the very foundations of Hogwarts, until it narrowed and darkened, with only a circular door at the end. "Just through the, and you're back," said Sirius, pointing to the door. "You need to climb over there, then up." He smiled at Cecilia. "Last night," said Cecilia, turning to Sirius. "Thank you. I would have been in trouble if Mr. Snuffles hadn't arrived." She smiled, indicating a touch of familiarity before turning to go. "Don't mention it," said Sirius. "By the way, be careful with that door." Cecilia turned back. "Why?" "It's been there for over 100 years, and I don't think it has seen the likes of anything that big before." He chuckled, and slapped her on the bottom. "How dare you!" Cecilia blushed and spun round, seeing the smirk on his face. "I'll thank you to keep your hands to yourself, Black," she said, indignantly. Now, Mrs. Frobisher, however can I resist, with something as big as that? Don't forget I've seen it in the flesh, so to speak." Cecilia raised her hand. He deserved the slap that was coming to him this time, the arrogant so-and-so. But Sirius was too quick for her, and he caught her wrist. "You shouldn't go round doing things like that, Cecilia," he said softly. "It hurt last time." Suddenly, he took her hand and kissed the back of it, and looked back deeply into her eyes as he did so, his own full of sorrow, regret. Then he pulled her closer, and leaned in, pressing his lips firmly to hers, a long full kiss, making Cecilia gasp. She allowed him to pull her closer, feeling the warmth of his body through her clothes. His muscular chest. His heartbeat. The tingly sensation running down her spine, giving her an irresistible urge to. Just as suddenly, she pulled away and continued the slap which had been so rudely interrupted. "Ow," said Sirius, looking confused. "What was that for?" "That was for trying to kill me in the summer," she said, brightly. "Now I think we're quits, Mr. Black." She turned to go. "Thank you again for showing me back." "It was a pleasure, Cecilia," said Sirius, rubbing his cheek. "I'm sure we'll see each other soon. Goodbye." Cecilia turned towards the door and began to proceed into Hogwarts, contemplating the way she had to go when she reached the Gryffindor floor. "Cecilia." She turned back round. Sirius was beckoning her from a few yards down the passage. She walked back to him. "Yes?" she said. Sirius smiled, and grabbed her hand. "For the research," he said simply, looking straight into her eyes. Without waiting for her to reply, he strode back down the passage towards the grounds, without turning back. Cecilia watched him go, then looked down into her hand. It was a lock of his hair. Never had Cecilia walked so fast through the corridors of Hogwarts, down the stairs and back across the first floor, into the teachers' quarters and straight into her own room. Slamming it behind her, she leaned against it, her heart racing almost as fast as her mind. She stood there for a while as she tried to sort out her chaotic feelings. The school clock chimed 6 o'clock. Cecilia looked down at Sirius's hair in her hand, and her mind cleared. With her back still against her door, at 6 a.m. on her 29th birthday, she smiled.